Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the ideal list of Richard Strauss operas. This is actually kind of fun. It's a thorny topic, and I love thorny topics because Strauss's opera career was, in some senses, successful though it was, rather tragic because, he wanted to do nothing but be a composer of comic operas, a la Mozart. That was his model. That was his dream. But being German, the idea of being a comic opera composer was out of the question. And later in his life, when he actually had the freedom to do it because of his earlier successes, he had horrible problems finding the right librettists, and in addition, he had a few minor sort of historical quibbles to contend with, such as the Nazis and World War I and the Weimar economic collapse and the end of the German monarchy and the whole patronage system under which he had thrived. I mean, he really had a difficult career. Nobody really takes that into account in considering his operas, but when you look at what he did, especially later in his life after Die Frau und Schatten, when he was writing mostly one comedy after another, except for Friedenstag, possibly the most terrible opera ever written by a major composer, you have to feel for the guy. You really do. So in order to come up with the ideal list of Strauss operas, you not only have to pick the best performances, you have to pick the best operas, because this is not a list for hardcore Straussians. This is a list for a normal, and I use that term guardedly, a normal collector who wants to have really the best Strauss operas in performances with no weak links. And I've chosen some perhaps surprising or unusual performances of some of the more popular ones just to show how easy it is to come up with some really great Strauss without having to get Birgit Nilsson. Now, should you want to get Birgit Nilsson, by all means, go ahead and get Birgit Nilsson. She's amazing. Her performances are fabulous. I'm going to say that straight off, but she's not going to be in this list because I'm trying to make the point. Now, I'm trying to make the point that there's a lot of other great Strauss out there. He really was a great composer and wrote great music for singers besides Birgit Nilsson. And so there you have it. Are you ready? So here we go. The first great Strauss opera that you need to consider is Salome. But the problem is there were two operas before that. There was Guntram and there was Feuersnot, pronounced in German Feuersnot, as opposed to English Feuersnot. Feuersnot we'll get to in a moment. But Guntram was the first of them. Guntram is a post-Wagnerian farrago of nonsense, which, like all of Strauss, has some really good music in it. It was written, at the same time as the first tone poems. He was a fully mature composer, but he had a problem with the post-Wagnerian plot that involves a knight and a good guy and a bad guy, and the knight kills the bad guy, and so he's supposed to go into penance, but Strauss decided not to have him be penitent, but rather to renounce his girlfriend and the whole knightly BS and go off on his own, and that completely freaked out the Wagnerians, who, because they were Wagnerians, knew exactly how the plot was supposed to go, in keeping with, Lohengrin and sort of Wagnerian philosophies of renunciation of pleasure and life and misery and acceptance of honor and stuff. And oh gosh, it's all such nonsense. Strauss was never cut out for that, and he knew it. So that was Guntram, and it was never successful, and nobody cares about it now. Next comes Feuersnot. Now, Feuersnot is a comedy, which is why it was a flop. It's about a wizard who puts a curse on a whole town because he's in love with the mayor's daughter, and they don't like him, and he puts out all the fires. Feuersnot in German, or Feuersnot, means basically emergency. Is what it means. But it's an emergency having to do with fire, or light, because he puts out all the fires in the town and everybody gets upset until he gets what he wants and then he lights them again. But the most important thing about Fire Snot is that it has a wonderfully erotic love scene, because nobody portrayed sex in music better than Strauss. I don't mean sex as in love. I mean sex as in the actual act of pummeling and thumping and that stuff, the erotic physicality of sex. Strauss does that so well. And the first time he does it so well is in the love scene in Fire Snot. So if you're into that kind of thing, then you really should hear it, because Fire Snot is a very, very beautiful opera. It really is. It just happens to be comic and silly, and the comicness and silliness has always counted against it, because nobody gives Strauss credit for being able to write a comedy. But that was what he did well, and he knew it. He really, really knew it. He knew he could do it if only he had the opportunity and the right story. And unfortunately, in Fire Snot, he hadn't quite gotten there yet. Okay, that's the first two. Then he wrote Salome. Now, you would not think that Salome is exactly a comic opera, since it's about a nymphomaniac princess who has an orgasm while cuddling and smooching with the head of John the Baptist, who she has just had killed because he doesn't love her, and she's a sort of celebrity stalker type. But John the Baptist is actually one of Strauss's first comic characters. Strauss referred to him rather contemptuously as a clown, and he wrote for him that way. If you listen to Salome, his tune, his main theme, is a comic theme. It's do-do-do-do-do, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's really kind of disturbing. That's what makes the whole thing disturbing. The introduction of these sort of whacked out, grotesque comic elements into this story of total, ultimate, complete depravity. Oh, it's so cool. I mean, Herod is also a comic character. Herodias is really a comic character, and she's bitchy and witchy, and she's always telling her husband, "Your father was a cattle driver and your mother was a hooker, and I don't know why I married you." And there are elements there. Salome is a glorious score. It's basically a Strauss tone poem with voices. It's symphonically knit together. You can listen to it from beginning to end. It's about an hour and 45 minutes long. Absolutely continuous. It's just glorious. And there are many, many wonderful recordings of it. I mean, the big ones are, of course, Birgit Nilsson and Hildegard Behrens, and, something with Crystal Goltz from the 50s, maybe the Clemens Krauss recording. There are plenty of good Salomes floating around out there. There are also quite a few crappy Salomes. I also like the Cheryl Studer Sinopoly, even though it's fashionable not to like Cheryl Studer because she did too much of everything, but she was in very, very good voice then. One of the real Salome sleepers, total sleepers, is on Chandos. With Danish forces. I think it's Inga Nielsen as Salome. It's really, really good. Absolutely. Michael Schoenwand, I think, is conducting. I have it right over here. I could look, but you get the point. It's on Chandos. But here's the thing. If I'm going to pick a recording of Salome, I'm going to pick one that you probably don't think of when you think of great Salomes, but it is truly one of the great Salomes with one of the great Strauss conductors and one of the great sopranos in the universe, and that is Kabaye and Leinsdorf. This is one of those, it was always like the other great Salome, the one that everybody said was great, but nobody paid much attention to, and making lists of great Salomes, but it truly is great. Leinsdorf was a theatrical conductor to the manner born. It's exciting. It's fabulously played by the London Symphony Orchestra. And Kabaye is glorious. She's one of the most beautiful voices of the 20th century. She was famous for not doing the Dance of the Seven Veils herself because she knew she was a large woman and would look foolish, and so she had someone else do it. And I can't blame her a bit, but it doesn't matter on a recording. This is really fabulous. The cast is her, and Regina Resnick is Herodias, and Richard Lewis is Herod, and Cheryl Milnes is Yohanan the Baptist, and James King even pops up. I mean, James King is Naraboth, who does nothing except stab himself. He goes, 9-9, princessin, like that. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal. Fabulous, fabulous Salome. And it's cheap. So, you can get, like I said, you can get Birgit Nilsson with Schulte, you can get Hildegard Behrens with Karajan, you can get Cheryl Studer with Sinopoli, but I would get this. It is great. Absolutely great. So, Salome, Kabaye, Elektra. Elektra's next. Now, Elektra is kind of Salome on steroids. It actually goes a step farther, and everyone thinks that it's really a pity that Strauss didn't write more Elektras. I think one is plenty. I really do. Not that there's anything wrong with Elektra. Elektra is absolutely fabulous. It is as far as Strauss went in these sort of radical, crazy, extended, late romantic, decadent, chromatic, almost atonal in places, musically adventurous scores. It really is. It's a phenomenal piece for that reason. But it's also a great opera. It's a wonderful drama, a character study, and pathological obsession among three women. I mean, put three women together and you're bound to get pathological obsession. And, we all know the story. Elektra wants revenge. She gets it. She goes crazy. She dies. That's the story. But the music is stunning. Absolutely stunning. I remember one of the great performances of Elektra that I ever had the opportunity to hear was the live Vienna Philharmonic with Lauren Mazel in Carnegie Hall with Eva Marton was Elektra. And they had all the singers on this giant platform above the orchestra, and they had the Vienna Philharmonic. It's an enormous, enormous orchestra. It's just huge down below, and they were just playing their hearts out. And when the end comes, when Orestes shows up and the murders happen and the chorus is celebrating Orestes and Elektra's doing her dance of death, and I mean, you just were pushed against the back of your seat like this. It was like the commercial, the Memorex ad or whatever it was with the, the waves of pressure coming at you from the orchestra down below. It was unbelievable. I mean, Elektra is an amazing, amazing thing. My first stage performance of it was at the Met with Denitsa Mistilovich and Leinsdorf conducting, actually. So, it's just an amazing opera. And the one I have chosen is not Birgit Nilsson or Inga Borg with Bohm. Inga Borg was also a famous Salome, Elektra. And, you might want to get like, I don't know. There's just so many of them. But I chose, and this one I think is really going to surprise you, Sinopoli. Sinopoli with the Vienna Philharmonic with, let's see, who's doing what? Elektra is Alessandra Mark, and Chrysothemis is Deborah Voigt, and Clytemnestra is Hannah Schwartz. Clytemnestra is such a great character. I mean, you really want to hear Astrid Varney do Clytemnestra. You get the Bohm video, the one with Leonie Rieseneck. It takes place in sort of a Max Headroom / Dr. Strangelove rock quarry factory setting. It's really quite amazing. And let's see here. And Siegfried Jerusalem is Aegisthus, and Orestes is Sam Raimi. But the reason to get this Elektra is for Sinopoli and the Vienna Philharmonic, because it reproduces that experience that I heard at Carnegie Hall. This thing is so stunningly, shockingly recorded sonically. It'll just blow you against the back wall. And the truth is that in Elektra, the orchestra is just as important as the singers. This is phenomenally well conducted, and I think this is just a stunner. If you don't know Elektra, if you're starting your Strauss opera collection, this is just a great one to have, because it will totally turn you on to Strauss. By the time it's over, you will be hooked on Strauss. I guarantee it. And the singers are more than just people along for the ride. They're very, very good. It really is. It's a terrific performance. Then, according to Klemperer, Strauss poured sugar water onto his music, and it was all downhill from there, because the next great opera was Derozan Cavalier. Or some people call it Derozan Clavier, the Rose piano. But no, it's the Night of the Rose. It's a comedy. And from then on, Strauss did not look back. He was going to do a comedy, whether posterity agreed with him or not. And quite frankly, there are some really good comedies that followed that nobody pays any attention to. And I think that's really sad. I mean, works such as Der Liebe, der Danae, which is really a good opera, and Die Schweigsame Frau, which is arguably a masterpiece, just terrific. Although we're not going to talk about it here. Intermezzo, which is a very interesting theatrical study that Strauss wrote based on his own life. There's lots of good stuff, but they are not going to be on this list because they're really for more specialized tastes. Once you've gotten your basic Strauss collection in order. So Rosen Cavalier, it has great roles for great singers, and that's what keeps it going. It is a genuine comedy. It's delightfully fun. It is a little bit decadent and tacky, and it may be a little overly sweet and overly sugary, and it does have one quality which Strauss later had. For a composer who wrote so many operas, he had a totally defective sense of theatrical timing. In other words, with Strauss, the singing starts when the opera is over. It happens in a way, you get a sense of it in Salome because, she gets the head and then she sings for 20 minutes. And you kind of think the opera's kind of over at that point. What is she, then they kill her. All of a sudden it's gone in a snap. Elektra's a little different. Elektra moves a little bit more swiftly to its denouement with Elektra's Dance of Death. The monologues happen along the way. But in Derozan Cavalier, you have all this folderol going on, and then the third act, which is the punishment of Baron Ochs, for being ox-like. It's kind of mean, because German comedy is kind of cruel. You know what I mean? Remember Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks that ends with his merry trial and happy hanging? That's German humor. And so Strauss had that kind of, some people call it sort of bourgeois humor. I don't know what you want to call it, but yes, there is this sense. So Ochs gets mercilessly pilloried at the beginning of Act 3, which is why most people think Act 3 is the weakest act of the 3 acts of the opera, because it doesn't have sex, which is how the opera starts, with one of the most graphic portrayals of the actual act and the climax of said act in all of music. And then there's the love stuff in Act 2 and the presentation of the rose and all of that those juicy moments. Then they dump all over Baron Ochs, and then the whole stage clears while the 3 women sing. And they sing and sing and sing and sing and sing. It's gorgeous. It's arguably the final trio, the best part of the opera, but it has nothing to do with the rest of it because all the action is over. And then, of course, the Marschallin says, "Ja, ja," in response to Faninal's comment that, they're all like this. The young people are all like that. She goes, "Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah." And then the opera's over. So there is that element that became increasingly prominent in Strauss's operas. It's as if he couldn't stand the plots he had to set and was just waiting to get to the part where everyone could just stand there and sing. Anyway, Rosen Cavalier also has many, many great performances. There's Karajan's first one. There's Bernstein's, which is really quite wonderful. There's Schulte's. There's just lots of them. There is no shortage. However, my choice for Kleiber is actually for Kleiber. For Rosen Cavalier, I gave it away. For Rosen Kleiber is Kleiber, Erich Kleiber. This is such a great Rosen Cavalier. And, this is in mono, but it's perfectly good, listenable mono. It's quite beautiful. The cast is, let's see, the Marschallin is Maria Reining, and Ochs is Ludwig Weber, and Octavian is Shana Urinach, who was really, really wonderful. Also, she was Mrs. Clemens Krauss, I think, when we get right down to it. And let's see who else is in there. Well, Hilda Gurdon is Sophie. And here's the point. There was in Vienna in the 1950s, in the immediate post-war period, just this wonderful ensemble cast. And you can hear it in these Erich Kleiber recordings. You can hear it in his Don Giovanni and the other stuff he did. This is one of the great sort of ensemble cast Strauss performances. And you really ought to hear it. You ought to hear an echt Viennese recording with that wonderful, wonderful company that was around in the 50s. They also got together, the same folks, and did Die Frau and Schatten under Bohm. That was just an amazing performance as well. Though it won't be the one that we picked, but that's okay. So, Eric Kleiber for Derozan Cavalier, without a doubt. Next, Ariadne of Naxos. Now, Ariadne of Naxos began life as the second half of a double bill, the first part of which was the Bourgeois Gentilem, which became that suite, that delightful orchestral suite. It's written for a chamber orchestra. It is also a comedy. It's a very good comedy. It's a very funny comedy, actually, and it really shows the tension in Strauss's work between comedic and serious elements, because, of course, the plot, the first act, is the composer is told, the young composer is told by his noble patron, that there's a troupe of comic characters, and he has to rearrange his serious opera about Ariadne marooned on the island of Naxos and lamenting her maroonedness, that he has to mix that with something for the comic characters to do. And that is where we get the fabulous mixture of silly, funny, and dark, tragic, serious stuff, which is Ariadne of Naxos. Now, Ariadne is written for a chamber orchestra of like 20-some-odd players. It is absolutely gorgeous. It is so much fun. And I just think my favorite recording of Ariadne, it's also been recorded 1 million times, very well by lots of people. My favorite recording is Kempe with the Staatskapelle Dresden and an amazing cast. You've got let's see, Gundula Janowitz and Zerbinetta, who has the craziest coloratura soprano aria written in the entire 20th century. Is Sylvia, what's her name here? Sylvia Gesatzi. I don't know. She sings it well. I don't care what her name is. And you get to the composer is Teresa Zillis-Gara. You know, all these people with names you can't pronounce. And you've got James King is in here as Bacchus and the tenor, the vain, annoying tenor. And then Theo Adam is in here, and it's just great. But really, Kempe, one of the great Strauss conductors in the history of mankind, and the Staatskapelle Dresden, the great Strauss orchestra in the history of mankind. And what a Ariadne of Naxos this is. You never want to leave Naxos, even though Ariadne is kind of a drag. I mean, as a person, not as an opera. Great, absolutely great. So for Ariadne of Naxos, a true, delicious masterpiece of comic opera-ness. It's amazing. Of course, like all Strauss operas, and like Derozan Cavalier, the singing starts where the opera ends. There's this long final scene after the whole plot's gone, and Bacchus does his thing, and then they sing this endless epilogue. The endless epilogue became a Straussian hallmark. Of course, that makes Strauss a wonderful composer for recital records, because you can chop off the endless epilogue and stuff it onto highlights discs of, Strauss's greatest hits without doing any damage to the opera at all, because these epilogues are all completely detachable. Okay, so after Ariadne of Naxos, we get Frosch, which is German for frog. But if you look at the word frog, F-R-O-S-C-H, you can use that as an anagram for die Frau ohne Schatten. Get it? The lady without a shadow. Now, Die Frau ohne Schatten is Strauss's greatest opera. It really is. It uses an orchestra that's even bigger than Elektra, that's not the reason it's his greatest opera. It's his greatest opera because it's 3.5 hours long of totally first-class music, from first note to last. It has 3 fabulous roles for the 3 women. That is the Empress, the dyer's wife, and the nurse. And it has Strauss's greatest baritone role. I mean, really, the greatest baritone role since Wagner's Hans Sachs. It is. It's amazing. It's Barak the dyer. And you've got a sort of good role for a tenor, which is the Emperor. And then you've got the orchestra, which is the bad guy, the evil spirit. Well, I mean, let me give you the plot of Die Frau in a nutshell. Okay, you ready? Here we go. Die Frau Schatten takes place on the South Sea Island. The Empress is captured. She's a shapeshifter, by the way, and she's shifting shape, and she gets captured by the Emperor. The Emperor, she turns into a woman. The Emperor marries her, but because she doesn't have a shadow, she can't have a child. He can't get her pregnant. Because he can't get her pregnant, he's going to turn into stone. So she has to get a shadow. So the nurse, who hates humankind, decides she's going to help the Empress steal a shadow. So she finds Barak and his wife, Mrs. Barak, and they're very upset with each other, and they're not getting along, and Mrs. Barak won't give him children because she won't sleep with him because she's upset with her life. He has 3 sort of special needs brothers who will go running around with a hump and a thing, and then it doesn't make any difference. And so the Empress and the nurse go down to earth, and they proceed to bribe Barak's wife to give up her shadow. So after in Act 2, that whole thing works out, and she says she's going to do it, and the Empress won't take the shadow because it's bloodstained, and she's upset, and the whole earth opens up and swallows everybody. This boat comes along, and the nurse and the Empress get in, and they get carried off to Kaikobad's or Kikoman or whatever his name is, Kikoman's realm. So in Kikoman's realm, she sees that her husband, the Emperor, has been turned to Stein. Stein. That's the motive. He's turned to stone, and she has to drink from the fountain, which is going to make her die if she drinks from the fountain, but it'll turn him to stone or something like that. And she has this huge monologue with where she's shouting and screaming and carrying on, and the nurse gets punished, but she says, Ich will nicht. I won't do it. Damn it. And so Kaikobad releases the prince, and he de-stonifies or de-petrifies or whatever you want to call it. And then it's Strauss. The 2 happy couples, Barak and his wife, get back together and decide that they can really love each other, hopefully. And the Empress and the prince, the Emperor and the Empress are reunited, and the unborn children, there's a chorus of unborn children singing from the womb. Oh, isn't that fun? They all get together at the very end, and they sing a quartet that goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. You get the picture? That's Die Frau Schatten. It's great. Just great. And the recording you should get, it really is great. It's just wonderful. The plot's nonsense, but who cares? Schulte. The reason I picked this one is because it's complete, first of all. There's a new recording on Orfeo, by the way, with Telemann, which is also excellent. Our opera guy, Bob Levine, loved it, and I can understand why. But this one is just so, it's like the Elektra with Sinopoli. The orchestra is glorious. The performance is exciting, is very exciting. You've got Placido Domingo, Julia Verdi, and Reinhild Runkel, whatever her name is. Yeah, Reinhild Runkel is the nurse. An almost impossible role to sing because Strauss hated her and she hates humankind, and the writing is like totally atonal with crazy leaps and stuff. And it's a voice wrecker of a role. And it's Jose Van Damme is Barak, and Hildegard Behrens is the dyer's wife, which is really a great role. I know you probably want to hear like Rieseneck and Nilsson in one of the stereo Bohm recording, but it's cut. All the Bohm recordings are cut. Strauss didn't seem to really care very much about cuts. Bohm cut and cut and cut and cut. Even his Vienna recording, the wonderful Vienna recording, has cuts. I think you should hear it complete. I really do. I think you should experience, let me slow down, the whole opera in all of its plenitude and effulgence. It really is one of those pieces. You can't rush it. We do Wagner complete. This is like 10 times more exciting than Wagner. It's wonderful. So, Schulte for Frau. But, there are some other great ones. There's Sawallisch was very good. And that Bohm Vienna one, I love it. I dearly love it, but not as a first recording. I think in making an ideal list, you should hear each opera in its entirety. And then once you know it and love it, you go and, supplement with other performances that have other virtues and other singers who you might particularly appreciate. Okay, so now we come to the vast wasteland of the 1920s, the late 20s and 30s, where Strauss really was in the wilderness. Hofmannsthal died, and his favorite librettist was, Stefan Zweig or whoever it was Jewish, was exiled and committed suicide, and he had a real problem. But he wrote some great operas. There's some that I dislike, even though they contain wonderful music. One of them is Arabella, which is kind of like the trailer trash version of Rosen Cavalier. You know, it's a really unpleasant opera about a glass of water. I mean, that's all you need to know about Arabella. But I think Die Liebe der Danae is really a good piece. Die Ägyptische Helen has some of the most beautiful music Strauss ever wrote for soprano, attached to a plot that, it has the great all-seeing clam. I mean, that's one of the main characters is a shellfish of some sort, I mean, that tells you all you need to know about it. It makes no sense. The music is Strauss. It is most beautiful in some ways. Like I said, Friedenstag, ugh, what a mess, horrifying. But Friedenstag is about war, and it doesn't really have a love interest, and it has a celebration of peace. It was intended as sort of like a Beethoven's ninth answer, and the sort of Nazi, oh, you just don't want to know. But there is a masterpiece from this period, and that masterpiece is Daphne. Strauss's Greek operas, the ones where he delves into the world of mythology, are in a class by themselves. I mean, they really are. They form a whole subgroup in his operas. And it was, as we found out from Elektra, it was a universe that he was very, very comfortable exploring. And it allowed him to indulge his gift for comedy and a certain lightness of touch that would have been more difficult for him perhaps in other media, because these are all basically fairy tales, right? And isn't it kind of funny how everybody dumps on like Rimsky-Korsakov for writing fairy tale operas, but Strauss's operas are fairy tales too. And they get dumped on too, probably for the same reason, although he's taken more seriously because he was Deutsch, he was German and not Russian. Anyway, that's another topic. Daphne. Daphne is, well, we know the story of Daphne. All you need to know, she gets turned into a tree. End of plot. And there is, of course, a long, concluding transformation scene where Daphne is getting turned into a tree. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. And she gradually becomes more and more tree-ish. The music becomes more and more ethereal. And she starts losing the gift of language and just goes, ooh, she's a tree. That's the story. Daphne turns into a tree. Everything before that is kind of silly, and it's fine. The music is Strauss's pastoral mode at its very, very finest. It's incredibly beautiful. It's one seamless act, basically. And this is the Böhm recording. It's live. It's marvelous. The work was dedicated to Karl Böhm. There are other fine recordings of Daphne, of course. But basically, it's one of the late masterpieces by Strauss, and it's really an essential work. And it's essential for you to have some good late Strauss, so you get a sense of his somewhat retrogressive, but really beautiful style. And let's see, this one stars Paul Schoeffler as Peneus. Is that his name? Yeah, something like that. Penniless. Whatever. And Gaia is Vera Little, and here we go, Daphne, Hilda Guden. Oh, Hilda Guden, she was wonderful. And Leukippos, who gets killed by Apollo because, Apollo's jealous because he likes Daphne. I mean, there is actually a plot in this somewhere before she gets turned into a tree. Anyway, that's Fritz Wunderlich. Yes, and Apollo is James King. And you have the Wiener this is the Wiener Symphoniker, not the Philharmoniker, but who cares, under Karl Böhm. Absolutely great. You got to hear Daphne. Daphne is essential. Finally, yes, we come to the end. There is Strauss's last opera, Capriccio. Now, Capriccio is, it's called a conversation piece for music, because it's not about anything. It's about the choice of words versus music. It's based on an earlier concept, an earlier plot, called First the Music, then the Words, or First the Words, then the Music, primo la parole, dopo la musica. There's always been this conflict in opera on what's more important, the story, the play, the words, or the music. Strauss, it would seem, from all of his prior operas, thought ultimately that the music was more important. But for the sake of the conversation piece, he doesn't come to a conclusion. The story involves a countess who has a bunch of people in her house, and they're doing a production of an opera, and there's a philosopher and a composer, and they're arguing and bickering, and they go back and forth, and they're in love with the countess, and there's an Italian opera troupe, which is supposed to be comic, but which indulges in some typically German snottiness and prejudice about people of Italian descent who are treated rather shabbily and who behave rather boorishly, because that's the way that the boorish Germans like to sort of project their own boorishness on other people from other cultures. It's a very interesting psychological study there. But the bottom line with Capriccio is that in the end, the Countess can't decide what to do, and she sings a final scene, the Countess's solo final scene, in which she talks about how she can't decide. And it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. It's gorgeous. Gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. Fabulously gorgeous. And there are two great recordings of Capriccio. There is the Böhm recording with Gundula Janowitz as the Countess, and there's this is also mono Sawallisch with Elizabeth Schwarzkopf. It's okay when these are in mono because Strauss is using here a reduced orchestra, and there aren't a lot of flashy effects that require huge amplitude and stereo. If you have good, well-balanced mono sound, which is what this is, you're going to be in great shape. I mean, this is the one with Elizabeth Schwarzkopf as the Countess, and that is really the only character you need to know about Countess Madeleine. The last line also is very resonant. It's "Madam, dinner is served," or something like that. That's the opera, end of the opera, and the end of Strauss's career as an opera composer. The last great flowering of that autumnal lyricism, which was the late career of Richard Strauss. So that is my ideal list of Strauss operas. I think that if you have this lovely, lovely Sawallisch Capriccio, this is going to take you some time to get into, I think, because, the non-plot and the chattiness of it, it's a work that Strauss wrote for himself more than anything else, just to let it all hang out one last time, to display his love for the soprano voice, and to be able to write an opera that wasn't under any pressure. But it, too, is a comedy. We have to remember that these are comedies. And I think, as I said, if you look at these operas after the first couple, after Salome, I guess, from the lens of comedy and adjust your expectations accordingly, you're going to have an absolutely fabulous Straussian experience. So that is my ideal list of Strauss operas. Keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me.